On Wednesday, August 19th, Moderna's stock closed at $174. The day before, it had closed at just $63. That is a gain of about 177% in a single session, which is the largest one-day move in the company's history. And it took the company's market value from roughly $25 billion to $69 billion. What caused it was a press release. Merck and Moderna announced that a phase 3 clinical trial of a personalized mRNA cancer therapy had met its endpoints in melanoma. The release described the trial design and said that the treatment had worked. It did not include the efficacy numbers, however. Those the company said would be presented at a medical meeting later and shared with regulators. So the market moved about $44 billion on the news that a result exists without actually seeing the results. My name is Christopher Shore, and I'm a 6th-year MD-PhD medical student. For today's video, I want to lay out what was actually reported and what wasn't, explaining what this therapy is, and share with you where I think all of this is heading. If you find this video useful, hitting that like button down below genuinely helps. Let's get into it. Okay, what was actually reported? The trial is called INTERPATH-001. It enrolled 1,137 patients with high-risk melanoma, stages 2B through 4. All of whom who had had cancer surgically removed and none who had received prior systemic therapy. They were randomized 2-to-1. One group received Keytruda, which is the current standard of care in this setting. The other group received Keytruda plus a personalized mRNA vaccine called intertismeran autogene. Treatment ran for about a year. At a pre-planned interim analysis date, the combination beat Keytruda alone on the primary endpoint, which was recurrence-free survival, meaning the time before the cancer comes back. It also beat it on the key secondary endpoint, distant metastasis-free survival, meaning the time before the cancer appears somewhere else in the body. The companies reported that the safety profile was consistent with that they had seen in earlier studies and no new risk identified. This is the most of what we know at the moment. The reason why this shot up Moderna's stock price is that this is the first time a personalized neoantigen cancer therapy has succeeded in a randomized phase 3 clinical trial. Not the first time for this particular drug, but the first time for this approach. Basically, every cancer has background mutations. Some of those mutations are shared among many patients, and some of them are unique to one tumor in one person. When a cell is carrying those mutations and builds proteins, some of those proteins come out slightly altered. Those altered fragments are called neoantigens, and in principle, your immune system should be able to recognize them as foreign and destroy the cell that made them. However, in practice, this often fails because tumors are highly effective at avoiding immune attention. The approach here is to make the immune system pay more attention on purpose. A sample of the patient's tumor is sequenced and compared against normal DNA, which identifies the mutations that exist only in the cancer. An algorithm then ranks each mutation and how likely they are to provoke a T-cell response in the patient. And up to 34 neoantigens are selected. Those 34 are then encoded in a synthetic, man-made mRNA molecule, which is then injected into the patient's arm. The patient's own cells read that mRNA and manufacture the mutant protein fragments, and the immune system encounters them in a setting where it is now primed to respond. The result, when it works, is a T-cell population that has been introduced to the specific thing it's supposed to hunt, the cancer. Each time this is built for one person every time and manufactured in a matter of weeks. To clarify, these patients have already developed cancer. Surgery removed what was possible to be seen, but the goal of this therapy is to attack what remains that isn't seen. Where I think this is all going. The thing that I find most interesting about this result that has been published is the idea that underneath all of this isn't new at all. Neoantigen vaccines have been around for well over a decade. In advanced metastatic disease, where patients have large tumors and are quite often sick, they haven't worked well enough to change how anyone actually practices. There have been some signals here and there, but nothing quite definitive. Move the same technology earlier into the window right after surgery when there's very little cancer left, and it works. I don't think this is a coincidence, and I don't think it's specific to this particular drug. It probably says something how the immune system is actually working. When there's less cancer present, the immune system is less exhausted, and there's less of a suppressive environment that established tumors build up around over time. I think that the biggest development in oncology over the next few decades will come from intercepting cancer before it even begins in the first place, rather than treating it after it has. This isn't purely speculative either. A phase 3 clinical study has recently started in high-risk stage 1 lung cancer, which is about as early as an adjuvant therapy can go. And in January of this year, a trial published in Nature Medicine tested a vaccine in people with Lynch syndrome, which is an inherited defect in DNA mismatch repair that affects roughly 1 in 300 people and carries a lifetime cancer risk as high as 80%. Prevention trials are difficult in ways that treatment trials aren't. You're dosing healthy people, so your tolerance for side effects is close to zero. Your endpoint is an event that mostly doesn't happen, so you need very large numbers of participants following a very long exposure time. And that is slow and expensive, and it fits poorly with how drug development is currently financed. But the population is the reason to try anyway. Adjuvant melanoma is a fairly small indication by oncology standards. There are roughly 1 million Lynch syndrome carriers in the United States, and most of them don't know it. Add the other hereditary cancer syndromes, and the number gets considerably larger. That's the difference between a drug and a public health intervention. There's a real disagreement happening right now among the people who model this company, Moderna, for a living, and I think that the shape of it is worth understanding. Before Wednesday, the consensus rating was hold. Different data providers put the average 12-month price target somewhere between $49 and $55. 22 out of 24 brokerage covering the stock had it rated hold or worse. And about 13% had the tradable float was sold short, which was a substantial position. Then the results came out and the revisions followed quite quickly. Bank of America upgraded from underperform to neutral and raised its target from $40 to $170. William Blair upgraded to outperform. RBC went from 45 to 130. UBS went from 50 to 150. And Morgan Stanley moved from 39 to 89, with Goldman Sachs going from 67 to 120. Everyone's raising the roof. Look at what several of those firms did though. They raised their price targets dramatically and left their ratings exactly where they were. RBC still rates it sector perform, UBS still rates it neutral, Morgan Stanley still rates it equal weight. When a target moves by several 100% and the recommendation doesn't change at all, that's important knowledge. What's being said is that the price went somewhere and the model had to be updated to acknowledge it. That's a different thing from a change in conviction. When there's a more skeptical position, which I think deserves to be taken seriously, even where I'd push back on, JP Morgan's argument is roughly that the melanoma result was already assumed. Their model had 85% probability of success going into it. Adjuvant melanoma is a modest indication by immunology standards, and the asset is partnered with Merck, so Moderna doesn't capture all of the economics. On their math, taking the risk out of the melanoma program adds only a low single-digit percentage to what they think the company is actually worth. What actually matters in their view is whether this reads across to other tumor types, and there is no phase 3 clinical data on that yet. There's one number I keep coming back to here. One firm revised its 2032 sales estimate for this drug upward by roughly $200 million. The market capitalization moved by something on the order of 150 times that. My own read, and I'd stress that this is a read and not a recommendation, is that Wednesday wasn't really a repricing on melanoma. It was a repricing of the platform. What was being bought is the proposition that this technology works at all, which flows to 9 other clinical trials into a company that has fallen more than 90% from its peak from COVID, with real questions being asked about how long it can keep funding itself. Whether that turns out to be correct depends almost entirely on read across, and nobody has seen data on read across. I want to be specific about what's still missing because I think it's worth dwelling on. We have not seen a hazard ratio. We have not seen confidence intervals. We have not seen the breakdown by disease stage or biomarker. We have no overall survival data because the trial is still running and patients are still being followed for it. We don't know what fraction of patients couldn't complete the personalized manufacturing process, and we don't know the discontinuation rate. The closest thing we have to real numbers comes from the earlier phase 2b trial, which was presented at ASCO this year with a 5-year follow-up. In that study, the combination was associated with a 49% reduction in the risk of recurrence or death and about a 59% reduction in the risk of distant metastasis or death. Those are substantial figures. They also come from a much smaller trial with wide confidence intervals, which is the kind of result that justifies running a phase 3 clinical trial, not the kind that settles a question. In my last video, I argued that belief usually comes before observation and that you often have to take an idea seriously before it's reasonable in order to go look for it. I still think that's right. But there's a version of that which runs the other way. I think we have watched it happen on Wednesday. A very large number of people formed a confident view about the size of an effect based on a headline and filed it in the rest from expectation. The full Interpath 001 clinical trial results are still ongoing and will be presented at an international medical meeting. The companies haven't named which one yet, though the major oncology meetings in the fall are quite obvious candidates. When the abstracts for these meetings are released, that's when the real information will arrive. Beyond melanoma, the broader program includes 9 phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. There are at least 3 studies in non-small cell lung cancer, including high-risk stage 1 trial. There's work in bladder cancer, including one study combining this with the BCG vaccine in early stage disease, and studies in renal cell carcinoma. Earlier phase work is underway in pancreatic and gastric cancer. There are also 2 things worth watching that aren't clinical results at all. One is manufacturing. Every dose of this is built for one patient, so turnaround time, production capacity, and cost per patient are going to determine whether this becomes a widely used treatment or a narrow one. As far as I know, none of those numbers have been disclosed. The other is the policy environment. There has been a substantial hostility towards mRNA research in the United States health policy recently, including the cancellation of close to $500 million in federal mRNA research funding, and a FDA decision to decline review of Moderna's flu vaccine that was later reversed. Whether a cancer result changes how the public and the government think about the platform is an open question, and I don't have a confident answer to it quite yet. If you're thinking about this as an investor, I should say clearly that I'm a medical student and a graduate student, and I'm not a financial advisor, and that nothing here is an investment advice. What I point out is a few facts that are sitting clearly in plain view and are quite easy to miss in the excitement of it all. Consensus price targets are still below the current price share. The long-short position means that some part of Wednesday's move was mechanical rather than anyone's conviction. And because the asset is partnered, Moderna's share of the economics is smaller than what the headline opportunity suggests. None of that tells you which direction the stock goes. It does mean the risk and the excitement aren't symmetric. If you want to follow this for yourself, there are free tools that are more useful than commentary. ClinicalTrials.gov lists every trial in this program with its status and estimated completion dates. If you're thinking about this as a patient or someone with cancer in your family, there's a consequence here that I think gets underrated. If the direction I've argued turns out to be right, then knowing your own risk becomes a different kind of information than it is today. Right now, learning that you can carry a Lynch syndrome or a BRCA mutation buys you an intense surveillance and, in some cases, preventative surgery. Those are demanding, life-altering interventions, and it's understandable that a lot of people avoid finding this out. If you have any questions about your own risk, that's a conversation with your genetic counselor or your physician, not a YouTube video. But if you've been putting off finding out why cancer keeps showing up in your family, I'd say the calculation on this is starting to change. For as long as I've been in medicine, oncology has been organized around finding cancer that's already established and then trying to shrink it. The imaging, the staging, the drug development, the whole structure of the field assumes that the disease got there first and we're responding to it. What happened on August 19th is the first phase 3 clinical evidence that for this kind of therapy, the earlier you intervene, the better it works. If that relationship is real, and I think that it might be, then following it honestly doesn't stop at the surgical margin. It ends up at the person who hasn't gotten sick yet. I don't know what the next 20 or 50 years will look like. I don't know whether the stock is going to go from 60 to 200, and I'd be skeptical of anyone who tells you that they actually know. But I think the direction of the science is quite real and quite exciting. And I think we just got the first strong evidence for it. So I'll leave you with a question. Do you think that this reads across to other cancers, or is this just melanoma? Do you think that a preventative cancer vaccine, if it were available to you, would you take it? Let me know in the comments. I read through them. If you found this was useful, please hit the like button and subscribe down below. I'm Christopher Shore, and I'll see you in the next video.